Good afternoon. My name is Shira Newman. I'm the coordinator of arts programming here at the Rady Jewish Community Center. I'm pleased to welcome you all to the 2022 edition of Music and Mavens. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Babs Asper Center for Cultural Arts, the Asper Foundation, Jewish Federation of Winnipeg, Winnipeg Arts Council, the United Way, the Manitoba Arts Council, the Lampe Family Fund, Winnipeg Free Press, Jewish Posted News, Classic 107, and our individual donors for your financial support and commitment to our 2022 Music and Mavens series. The Rady Jewish Community Center is located on Treaty Number 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dene, and Dakota peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Before we start with today's presentation, I'd like to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. Number 1, while we anticipate there will be no technical issues during our presentation, please remember that this is live, and despite our best efforts, we may have some glitches, and we will work swiftly to correct any unforeseen issues. Number 2, we will be taping today's session, and it will be made available for viewing on the Rady Jewish Community Music and Mavens YouTube channel. I'd also like to let everyone know that the concert portion of Music and Mavens will be starting on February 22nd, and will be live and in person. For more information on this exciting series of daytime performances, please check out our website at radyjcc.com. Thank you very much, and I will now turn things over to Carla Berbreer, our Music and Mavens founding producer. Carla.
Well, hello, everyone. It's so great to have so many people here this afternoon, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. Our presentation today is quite different from the one that you attended, if those of you were here last week. And I'm super excited about this because I have just returned from Churchill last night. So this is really an exciting presentation for me. And I'm going to tell you a little about today's speaker. Dr. Stefan Peterson has been a wildlife biologist for more than 20 years and has been the Director of Conservation and Research for Assiniboine Park Zoo for the last 10 years. The Conservation and Research Department runs active field and zoo-based programs from the labs and offices at the Leatherdale International Polar Bear Conservation Center. His department has a strong focus on the ecology, behavior, and genetics of Arctic marine mammals, and they have been conducting research in Churchill for almost a decade. Some of the polar bear focused research includes using thermal imagery to understand polar bear energetics and mapping polar bear denning in Canada. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Stefan Peterson to Music and Mavens today with his topic, Manitoba's polar bears in a changing climate. Welcome, Stefan.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to join everyone and excited to yet again talk about polar bears. One of my top 3 favorite Arctic animals to talk about, only competing with ring seals and beluga whales, but maybe those can be different talks at a later date. I'm just going to share my screen here so that you don't have to look at my shining dome. We can look at some polar bears, usually a lot more interest there. All right. Everyone's faces has disappeared, so maybe someone can say yes. We have a PowerPoint presentation being shown right now.
Not yet.
Not yet. You know those technical difficulties. This is.
There we go.
Oh, yep. Part 1. I guess I was too fast on the draw. There we go. Okay. Excellent. So yeah, so today I want to try and cover a whole bunch of territory with a whole bunch of beautiful pictures of one of the most incredible species that we have here in Manitoba. So I want to talk a little bit about, you know, why do they occurs so far south in Hudson's Bay? Why do we even have polar bears in Manitoba? It's a really special thing that a location that's so far south actually has polar bears. So we'll talk a little bit about what are the circumstances that lead us to having polar bears. We'll go through kind of like talk through what polar bears are doing in the course of a year. They're part of an annual cycle, and when the key parts of that cycle really are. And then talk about a little bit about why we see different patterns in the population sizes across the entire Arctic, and talk a little bit about how climate change is affecting those populations, and not always at the same rate at the same time. And then, because we're talking about focused on Manitoba, I want to talk a bit about how polar bears are managed in Manitoba, and then also some of the cool things that I'm excited about here at the zoo, things that we're working on. So why do we have polar bears so far south? I have a little flattened map, and there's a line that goes through, maybe the bottom of Hudson's Bay, right at James Bay. And if you look at the green areas, that's where the polar bear range is. And for the most of the Arctic, it's far above that blue line. So there's, similar latitudes in Alaska, but really we have this really special circumstance of bears in Manitoba. And it's because of a couple reasons, or a few reasons. So one, Hudson's Bay is a pretty shallow body of water. It's not very deep. 150 meters is the average depth. It gets a lot of fresh water. So all of those blue arrows going into Hudson's Bay are all big inputs, big rivers that are carrying water from this enormous watershed that stretches over most of the continent, funnels fresh water into Hudson's Bay. And so that means that we get a body of water that can change temperature relatively quickly because it's shallow. There's not a lot of water in there compared to the big oceans. We have Arctic currents that are bringing cold water in from the north. And then that lower salinity and all that, because of all the fresh water, makes it so the water will freeze a little bit faster. And what it does is when we get those north winds in the winter, it drags the Arctic south onto our doorstep. And that, because there's those Arctic conditions further south, we also get happy polar bears further south. And so the next kind of question is why is Manitoba kind of this amazing place to see polar bears, or that we have this incredible natural heritage that is polar bears? So one of the reasons is we really have a really predictable pattern of currents within Hudson's Bay. We have this counterclockwise flow of currents with water coming from the Arctic archipelago in the north and circulating through the Hudson's Bay before it leaves. And water spends about 2 to 3 years in Hudson's Bay. So someone's done some calculations on how long a little bit of water spends there. So it's in there for a couple of years before it gets to go out to the Atlantic Ocean. And what this does, these patterns make it so we have a predictable freeze up and thaw. And so in the spring, because of the currents, the last of the sea ice is along the Manitoba and the Ontario coast. And so polar bears are staying on that sea ice until the last possible moment so they can be hunting seals. And so it kind of shifts all that population south towards Ontario, and then that ice melts and all those bears come off in Ontario and in the south of the province and in Wapusk National Park. One of the things to note is the longer that they can stay on that sea ice, the longer they can hunt seals and the better body condition they'll be in. And then if we think about in the fall, we get those same currents and the cold air that's in the north, making it so the sea ice is forming at the north and it creeps along the coast at the, the beginning of freeze up. And this means that the bears that want to be on the ice are moving north up and right past Churchill. So you can think of polar bears a little bit like snowbirds. They're at home in the winter, they go south in the summer when the ice melts, and then they go back home. Well, not necessarily in the winter. I guess it doesn't quite work. Anyways, they're moving north and south in order to try and maximize the time that they're out on that sea ice. And the earlier they can get back on the ice, the better condition, better chances they have at getting seals and being in better condition over that winter time. And as you probably all know, Churchill is in the middle of those movements back and forth. And so it's this great place in the fall as bears are moving northwards to meet that sea ice to see some really amazing behaviors. So the one that we're probably all, most familiar with is that of polar bears sparring. So this activity, whether it's play or play fighting, that male polar bears will do in that autumn time period. And so you get a sense that there's like an annual cycle that's repeating for polar bears that's really important. And one way to think about it is to just look at a normal year in the life of the Arctic. And you can see Hudson's Bay is going from completely ice clear to completely frozen over. And so the bears that are up there are responding to that annual cycle. If we look at the very top of that, and we'll have different slides, in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, it's a much different process. So the ice there sticks around for most of the year. So the bears are adapted to different conditions in the high Arctic. So what are polar bears doing throughout that year? I've split them into what the female polar bears are doing on one side, or the female pregnant polar bears, or the polar bears with cubs, and then everyone else on the other side. So if we think of the year in kind of three sections, we'll call winter from when the ice freezes up, usually in November, all the way into January-ish, when we start to get a little bit more heat in the sun, maybe February. So the female polar bears, they have been in dens for this whole time. They give birth to little polar bear cubs that are, a couple pounds of teeth and claws. They can't see. They've got, not very much hair, but they're protected in the den with the mom, so they can, grow and start to get bigger before they have to go out onto the sea ice within the protection of those dens. And in Manitoba, the female polar bears are largely denning on land and starting out in peat and in dens that are in the ground. But as that drifts over, they'll dig their way out into the snow a lot of times. And so cubs are born in December. Mom will nurse them until February or March. And while they're protected and the cubs are growing in the dens, all the other polar bears, so that would be males, subadult females, or adult females that aren't pregnant, females that have older cubs, so yearlings, they're going to be out on the sea ice and they'll be trying to catch seals. So it's not the best hunting of the year in the fall and winter, but they can generally get enough seals to keep going. The body condition for polar bears is the lowest in the late winter before we get into spring. And spring is really the key time of the year for polar bears. So females and cubs leave the dens and they head out onto the sea ice to feed. And they're heading out at that time period because that's when there's lots of ring seal pups, and things are melting so that they have access to other seals as well. So it's really that key time. So spring we'll call kind of, February, when there starts to get some heat in the sun, until all the ice is broken up. And that tends to be often July or August in a good year, late June in a year where breakup's a lot earlier. Females with 2-year-olds are going to wean them and they'll be out looking for a mate. Males are focused on making or trying to find a mate. And really all of the bears in the spring are trying to eat as much as they can. So there's the sciencey term, I guess, is hyperphagia. So it's like extra over above eating. And so they're trying to gain as much calories as they can to put them through the lean parts of the upcoming season. And so when that ice breaks up, all those bears are coming back to land. Females that are pregnant will head to the denning areas. Females with young tend to go inland, and they're just trying to avoid males for the most part. And all of the other bears are just trying to conserve energy. So they're not doing much wandering around. Definitely if they find something to eat, they're going to eat it. So, scavenging beluga whales, or sometimes even catching beluga whales is profitable. They might eat eggs and geese and these other things, but most of the population is just trying to conserve that energy until freeze up again and they can get back out on the sea ice. So that springtime is really a really critical part of the year for polar bears. So they're getting the most calories on average in that springtime. Polar bears are targeting the young ring seal pups that are in the dens. So female ring seals will dig a den that's on top of the ice, but still protected by snow on the top. They'll have the pup in that den and they'll just essentially start jamming them full of really rich milk. And they're trying to get that seal, that young seal, up to, a good enough size that it can get a good start on its life. So they spend about 39 days of feeding it before they're weaned. And at that time, the polar bears are out on the ice trying to catch those seals, but they also catch adults that are in the dens. And as the sea ice starts to break up, adults are also hauled out on the ice and they're molting their skin. So they go through an annual molt where part of the skin and the hair will molt off and get replaced. And so that's a key time for polar bears to be out there trying to, gain all of those calories. And the longer that the ice is present in the spring, the healthier that polar bear population is going to be, because they'll have more opportunities to get seals, be able to gain more weight. So with all that importance in the spring feeding, you might guess that as climate change warms up the entire environment, it's going to have some effects. So what we've been seeing in Hudson's Bay and really across the Arctic is the date of breakup. So in the spring, when that ice is breaking up, is getting earlier, and the date of freeze up is getting later. So this is compared to the 80s. And for Western Hudson's Bay population, we think that they were kind of doing the best in the 80s. So in the 70s and before, there was pretty high harvest pressure. And then we realized that we probably shouldn't shoot all the polar bears. And so we had changes, less harvest. Polar bear populations in Hudson's Bay responded to that positively. Plus the environment was like the golden years, just perfect. And so that's what's been changing over time. So overall, we're seeing in Hudson's Bay that the ice-free period is about 3 weeks longer. So not only, and most of that change is in the spring. So polar bears have less time to hunt seals in the spring, and then they're fasting for a longer time period until the ice freezes up in the fall. And so those two things, you might guess, might have some impact on the population. And what we've seen is in the 80s, we've definitely dropped in population size for Western Hudson's Bay since the 80s, but actually since 2000, it's been fairly steady. So we think it's around 800 animals, give or take. The challenge is that along this trend, we see that females on average are weighing less, and we're seeing fewer twins and fewer triplets in that population. So we think that, that environment is changing, and it's not good for polar bears, but we haven't seen big drops in that polar bear population like we did before. So the last aerial survey that was done was in 2011. Another aerial survey was flown last year. So hopefully we'll have new numbers, and hopefully that population has maintained there and not dropped any lower. So one of the interesting things I find is, there's a lot of variability in that system. So in the last 5 years, we've had, 2 really late freeze up years, and we've had 2 really early freeze ups and an average one. So we have all this variation, and we've had some, years where the breakup has been really late and some that have been really early. So there's all this variability, and really for polar bears, we want to have as many or more good years than bad years. And this picture kind of encapsulates that ability for polar bears to respond to good years. So this is the only set of triplets that I've seen in the 10-ish years of going to Churchill in the fall. And that was after, so a couple years of late breakups and a year of early freeze up. So I think this was like 2 years ago when we saw these guys. So super happy to see, and an indicator that, bears can respond in positive ways if the habitat and the seals are there. And this leads me to talk a little bit about, you might get contradictory sorts of things in the news about how polar bears, how the polar bear population is responding. Overall, we have this really clear link. Polar bears eat seals. They need sea ice to get to those seals. If there's no sea ice, they're not going to get to the seals. And the more we warm things up, the less sea ice there is. So there's a clear link. But when we look at how those polar bear populations are changing over time, it's not that straightforward. And part of it is because polar bears live over an enormous range. So from Manitoba to the other side of the range, and the range of polar bears is roughly within that black line, is 6,000 kilometers from Hudson's Bay over to Russia. Hudson's Bay itself is 1,000 kilometers either way, and bears are moving throughout most of that range. But throughout that range, it's huge. We have different weather patterns. We also have different ice patterns in different areas. So we have, we've divided or scientists, I guess, researchers in polar bears and sea ice have divided the range of polar bear into 4 areas where the ice is behaving in different areas. So we have, places where the ice moves offshore and will take bears away from the shore. We have areas where ice is moving onto shore. And then in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, we have that ice that's pretty constant and it's sitting, there's not a lot of movement in it. And then where we are, we have seasonal ice. It's completely gone or mostly gone each and every summer. And so that Canadian Arctic archipelago ice tends to be multi-year, it's thick ice, it's old ice, and it's not really great seal habitat, whereas that annual ice, that seasonal ice, gets refreshed every year, it's thinner, and that means that those areas are more productive and there's more seals. But it also means that as things warm up, those 2 areas are going to change in different ways. So the polar bear populations or subpopulations, the way it's moving is all the same, but how fast different areas move is going to change depending on where you are. So if you think about, projections forward, which is what these figures are, we have a lot of concern about those populations in the south and those seasonal ice zones area because we're losing that ice faster. It doesn't stick around. But in some of the other areas, we know that there's going to be ice for longer into the future if we keep doing business as usual. And I think what we should take from this is there's a lot of opportunity to make changes to try and slow down how things are going in the future. So, we can make changes and polar bears aren't going to go extinct because we have different areas that are responding differently, and polar bears will have some bastions, some places where they are surviving that they can recover from. However, it does look kind of worrisome for Manitoba. And this has led to different status for polar bears in different areas. So in Manitoba, very concerned about polar bears and their future in the province if the trend keeps going the way that it's going. But if we look at in Canada as a whole, the status is special concern. And part of that is because up in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, we have that multi-year ice that's switching to annual ice, which is good habitat for seals. So those populations, for what we know of them, because they're not really censused or counted, we don't have good counts on polar bears there, but we think that those are stable. There's some indication that some of them might be increasing, but again, we're not quite sure, but for sure, probably stable. So there's all these different changes, and that might be why there's some controversy in the news about what, how worried we should be about polar bears. I think we should be worried overall because we're going along this path, but we can do things. We shouldn't feel overwhelmed with that worry. I also noticed that nowhere are polar bears listed as endangered. And you will see that, especially in the media, people saying that polar bears are endangered, but they don't actually have the classification of endangered anywhere. Threatened, yes, which means that they're at risk of becoming endangered, but it also means, we can do something about that. So we're not all about waiting for the ice to form like this polar bear. Within Manitoba, we actually have this really incredible history of living with polar bears and managing polar bears. So the approach is two-pronged in a sense. So in Churchill, there's a polar bear alert program, and this has been a program that was started officially in the 80s and really works, especially during bear season, tirelessly to make sure that bears and people are as safe as possible. And so Manitoba conservation officers are out there. They'll trap polar bears that are coming close to town. They'll haze them out of towns because they're just trying to, get north. So they'll give them some incentive to keep going north. If they need to, they'll relocate those bears using helicopters. So the bear that's asleep on the back of that ATV trailer is going to get airlifted under a helicopter north of Churchill, and then it'll continue to go further north. And so this program is working, really great, such that in the 70s, there's probably about 11, or on average 11 bears per year were killed due to conflict with humans. And in recent years, it's been less than 2 a year. So really low. It allows for, this amazing opportunity for tourists to see polar bears, for a town to function safely in the middle of this really incredible top predator, and keeps everything going kind of and functioning safely up there. There still are polar bears that do run into trouble. So we do see orphan cubs. They're not a new thing. We're not quite sure how cubs are orphaned all the time. They could be separated because of aggressive males or hungry males. There's been some indication that potentially packs of wolves in Wapusk are separating mums and cubs and trying to predate cubs. It could be because of human interaction. So within the province, the policy on how we deal with orphan cubs have changed over time, and could include just letting nature take its course. Certainly in a large part of the province, that's probably the best option. Just letting nature take its course. There's been attempts to foster orphan cubs with wild mothers and wild families. We don't have a lot of information on that, but we know from genetics that successful adoption does happen naturally. We just don't know the complete, combination of things to get it to work with human intervention. Or those cubs can come down to a facility like Assiniboine Park Zoo, and be part of the bears that we have here. We also have problem bears. So problem bears, most of the problem bears in Churchill are relocated safely. If they can't be relocated safely, or if they've harmed a human, they're euthanized. And we do have one bear, Storm, here, who was a problem bear, who did bite someone, but the conservation officers were able to safely capture him. And so he's down in our care here in Winnipeg. And I just wanted to put a note in here too, that the way the legislation for the province is set up is that the province is always the owner of those animals and their offspring. And there's a whole bunch of regulations that cover, the care that they get, the housing, the food and enrichment that they're provided, but it also includes, the need for education programs and the need for conservation science to occur in conjunction with those bears. And really, we have this great opportunity by having bears in care to do a number of things. So one of the things that I think is really, providing some inspiration and some connection between people and polar bears. Most people will never get to see a polar bear in the wild. Lots of people will never get to see a polar bear at all. And Manitobans have just amazing opportunities for that. So at the zoo, we have this opportunity for folks that maybe can't get to Churchill to see polar bears. But we also think that, you know, by seeing them here, it might inspire you to go and see them in the wild as well. So we have this component that's making that connection between people and polar bears and the Arctic. And we're hoping that we can also provide, you know, materials and education to translate that connection and that love for polar bears to climate change action. And that's a big piece of why the province has decided that orphan polar bear cubs that would normally not live in the wild, they would normally die. Their survival is essentially zero. That's why they've decided that it's, you know, okay to bring them to out of their environment and to a facility, and they can be ambassadors for their species and for the Arctic. So one of the other important things that we do at the zoo is we have this really incredible opportunity to work with the bears in our care, and try and help bears in the wild as well. So, you know, we have these incredible facilities, but we also have a whole team of highly trained veterinarians, animal care professionals, and conservation scientists. And together we can work with those bears to do a lot of really cool research in order to help either scientists study bears in the wild less invasively, or better, and we also have some opportunities to contribute to making sure that those bears can be managed and people and bears can live successfully in the north. So I put in a shameless plug here for Arctic Vets, who is in season 2. But if you want to look at or watch both kind of how the animal care works here at Assiniboine Park Zoo, but also how the polar bear alert team is working in Churchill, the Arctic Vets is on CBC Gem, and you can stream that. So one of the projects that I like, and not only because it has great visuals, but we had a student that was looking at, you know, how do we study bears less invasively? And she was particularly interested in, you know, what's the energetic cost of this play behavior, this sparring behavior that we see in polar bears in Churchill in the fall. So one way to do that is to look at the temperature, how temperature changes. As you do a workout, you know how you heat up, same with polar bears. How much you heat up might be an indication of how much energy you're spending. And we can look at that without having to put any instruments on those bears using thermal imagery. So she was looking at using thermal imagery on the bears here, but eventually something that might be able to be used in the field to understand bear physiology and bear energetics. We also have been working with colleagues at Polar Bears International and other zoological facilities around North America to test out new satellite tag designs. So the little box in the center of that kind of plate or that pad is a satellite transmitter. And normally we put collars on bears, but you can't put collars on cubs because they're growing. You can't put them on any growing bear really. And they don't really go on male polar bears that well either because their necks are just big and strong and their heads are smaller. So those collars fall off. So we're working with other facilities and Polar Bears International to test out different attachment devices for these tags. They could be put on and then would just come off naturally, but we don't want them to come off too quickly. And so watching our bears, how they interact with these instruments are really a way that we can contribute to polar bear research in a really great way. We also do research on trying to understand more about polar bear denning in general and providing tools for land managers throughout the Arctic. So we've spent a lot of time going through and trying to create a map of where polar bears den in the Canadian Arctic. And then that's available to anyone who wants to, understand what sort of activities can be done on that landscape without disturbing polar bears. And then in addition to that, and building from that, one of the projects that we've just started and that I'm really excited about is looking more at polar bears in Western Hudson's Bay and in Manitoba. And so we know that those bears are denning in peat and in scrublands where there's trees. Some of the bears are going a couple hundred kilometers inland during the summer. We also know that those areas, as the climate changes, are going to be more prone to forest fires. So what the project that we're working on now is looking at Manitoba to see where the denning areas overlap with fire risk in the future. And so we want to have a good sense of where those things intersect in order to be able to make decisions on where we might want to fight forest fires in order to protect polar bear habitat or polar bear denning habitat. So that's a project that we've just started and we're really excited about. So that's some of the stuff that we're doing. I thought I would just end off with a few, what can you do? Part of the rationale that we have for bears here at the zoo is that we're making that connection and we're inspiring people to do things that will help polar bears in the wild. So I think, if we wanted my top three, what you can do, I think learning about polar bears and really falling in love with polar bears is a key part of this process. It certainly is the most enjoyable process potentially, or part of the process, seeing polar bears, observing their behavior, whether that's at the zoo or if you're able to go up to Churchill. I think we might be getting a little bit of fatigue, but there's lots of little things that we can all be doing to reduce our carbon footprint every day, and we should be looking for new opportunities and new ways to do that. But ultimately, we need some really great policies to guide us into the future. And so everyone needs to be making sure that people that they're voting for are going to create polar bear friendly policies that are going to help us keep polar bears in Manitoba and on the landscape far into the future. And I think all of these things are manageable and not intimidating sorts of things that everyone can do. And I hope that all of you can, join myself and the team at the zoo in doing those sorts of things. So I think that's everything for me. Thank you all for your attention. And I'm happy to take any questions. I think I'll unshare my screen. Is that? Yes, there we go. All right. I think Carla you might be on mute. I think for questions, if anyone wants to put them into the chat, welcome to do that. I think even you could probably unmute yourself and ask as well. I think we can handle that.
Okay, okay.
There we go.
There we go. Yeah, it seemed that there was a bit of a problem with the unmuting. So, okay, that was great, Stefan. And I think that if anybody would like to send Stefan a question, you can also do it through the chat. And you can do it to me. I think I sent a message to everybody. I see that somebody has also sent a message that they love the Arctic Vets programs. So you've already got somebody who's commented on that. You know, I just wanted to kick things off by Stefan by asking, you mentioned that Storm is a problem bear that became adopted at the Assiniboine Park Zoo. What is the normal method for the Assiniboine Park Zoo to acquire these bears? Are they usually problem bears that you get?
Yeah, so the policy has changed over time in Manitoba. And then, so a number of years ago, there was polar bears that were thought to come from Churchill in a really horrible situation in a circus, and all bears leaving northern Manitoba were stopped for a number of years. And then we got the polar bear legislation that said only under certain circumstances can bears come from Churchill or northern Manitoba down to our facility, and that's changed over time. So we had a number of bad years in terms of like seeing polar bear orphans every single year. Some of those were because of human conflict. So mom was accidentally killed. Some just showed up as orphans. And so those bears came down, and then Storm was our one that was, I say a problem bear. It's more problems for people than bears, but I guess it's a co-problem. So he bit someone in Churchill, but the conservation officers were able to safely put him to sleep, get him to a safe spot, and then he came down. So we can't release bears that might hurt people again back onto that landscape. So that bear would have otherwise died if it hadn't not come down. And then orphan cubs, we know that if they're younger than say 11 months, that's when we see them we tend to see them in October. They're about 11 months old. If they don't have their mom, they won't survive. There's some evidence that suggests that if they're 12 months older, so if they're like 22 months old, which would be the next season when we see them in Churchill, they can survive. So those ones, if they're orphans there, they just go on their merry way, and they have a decent chance at survival, as much as any yearling has a chance at survival. Life is hard for yearlings of any species. So currently it has to be bears that would otherwise die in the wild. So we're not affecting that population by having those bears come down to our facility.
Okay, so a question that has popped up is, does the zoo have any further capacity to host more bears? And are there plans to rotate some of the bears to other zoos?
Yeah, so we could, if we had to, rescue more orphans. The problem is orphans don't stay tiny and cute. They get older, and hormones start to roll through their veins and all sorts of other things. So currently the province doesn't want us to move any polar bears outside of the province. So the government doesn't want us to move polar bears outside of the province, but under the legislation, as it was initially intended, bears would go to other facilities if they were approved and we're kind of the highest quality and places for those bears. We see, you know, a small number of visitors compared to some other facilities. So there's some real potential, you know, to change the hearts and minds if bears are going to other facilities. But currently we're not able to do that.
So I've seen a plug for volunteering with the Assiniboine Park Conservancy that polar bears. Somebody has sent that in. Thank you to Sandra for commenting on that. Apparently, someone would like to know if it is only pregnant mums who hibernate. I'm not sure hibernate is the correct term here, but
Yeah.
how do you respond to that?
Yeah, so I mean, leave it to scientists to get very nitpicky about what hibernation is. I think polar bears aren't true hibernators in the sense that they're dropping their body temperature like way down. They do drop a little bit. So mums with cubs definitely are going into the den and we say they're hibernating. But we also know that other bears will hole up for shorter time periods. So it's usually associated with like really bad weather in the winter. So they'll, you know, dig a den into a snowbank and maybe just sleep for a week or two because hunting success would be really low because it's stormy and, you know, they can conserve energy in the winter by doing that. So it's not really hibernating, but they're in a den and they're out for, you know, longer than overnight. Although where this is happening, it's the Arctic, so overnight is, you know, 6 months. So maybe it is part of just overnight. Yeah, hopefully that's not too rambly.
So another comment that came in is that a few years ago, there was a study with polar bear fur comparing our bears with the northern bears, and wondering if there's been any results published on that study of polar bear fur.
Yeah, so that study is still ongoing. If you come to the zoo, you might see bears even now that have black dye spots on them. And so that was looking at how that hair is growing out. We've also been feeding some of the bears this specially labeled glycine, which gets incorporated into those hairs when they're growing. And so we're still doing hair plucks to see how that's growing and still dyeing the bears in order to do that. And the student, who's a University of Washington student, she's hoping to have everything wrapped up because it wasn't just our facility, it was several facilities. She's hoping to have everything wrapped up this year, so 2022. So no results yet, but we're still supporting that student and coloring our bears, I guess.
So another question, is there a breeding program for polar bears in Canada?
Yeah, so in zoos throughout North America and really the world, they have what's called species survival programs, and they create pedigrees and make matches between these animals. And so bears in this case, but more generally, most of the animals that are in human care in zoos are part of these breeding programs in order to maintain genetic diversity. Within Canada, there are recommendations for breeding for bears, but not for any of our bears. So one, we want to keep all the space we can available if we have to rescue cubs, so we don't want to have breeding there. And then also the province has decided that, you know, because we're not moving bears and we're not really sure how we deal with offspring of bears, that what we've done for all of the males that we have in our care is they've all been neutered. So in Canada, for bears, not our bears, in managed care, there is a breeding program, but we're not part of that currently. Yeah.
So another question, Stefan, is what are the bears at the zoo being fed? Do they get seal meat?
They would love it probably if they get seal meat, or some of them would. So they get a combination of things. So they'll get some kind of like bear specific kibble, so a dry food. They get carnivore chow that's chopped up meat with nutrients and oils added in for polar bears. And then they also get fish as well to supplement that. There are a few places and not very many that have the opportunity to give their seals their polar bears seal, but it's quite rare for bears in human care to get seal meat. And where they have been able to provide that, bears that have grown up from cubs, or if they were born in a zoo, they often aren't really that fond of seal meat. They like the oil, it's really high in fat, but they like fish oil too, but they're not so fussy about the meat itself. Yeah.
Another question, Stefan, can you share some examples of polar bear friendly policies and people or parties that are leading on that front?
Yeah, I think on the policy side of things, we have we always have opportunities to make changes that will promote move towards more renewables. In Manitoba, we're super lucky in a sense that a lot of our energy is coming from hydro. Granted, it comes with its own kind of challenges, but in terms of being green energy, that's really great. It makes it so that if we had more support for things like electric vehicles, we would be in a really great position to lower some of our transportation costs. So, if the city is looking at electric buses, might be something that we want to support. If the province wants to give subsidies so more folks can get electric vehicles, that might be somewhere to go. I know the province has been working on a polar bear management strategy for a long time. So it would be really great. It's one of the things that I've been kind of trying to push for a lot is, we have an initiative even recently to have polar bears as part of our provincial anthem along with the bison, but we still don't have a polar bear management strategy to kind of send a signal and chart a path forward on how we're going to manage these incredible species in our province. So there's lots of places where we can look out for polar bears and make environmentally friendly choices, which will help as well. And so just need to have an eagle eye out for them.
Okay, and this may be one of our last questions because we're coming to the top of the hour here, but will the bears have a chance to go fishing in their pool again?
I would love that. I don't think we have any immediate plans to put fish back in the pool. And so I personally always side with the predator wherever it is. So I really love seals, but if it's a seal and a polar bear, I'm rooting for the polar bear all the time. And so I always root for the polar bear, but we also know that there's quite a bit of concern about animal welfare, and that includes animal welfare for the fish that we're putting in the pools. So currently, the thought in lots of zoological facilities across the world is that even though it's really great for the bears to be able to hunt down those fish, it's probably pretty stressful for those fish, and we might need to find different ways to enrich their lives. So probably not fish in there unless I can find a small, beautiful fish that the polar bears aren't going to eat, but will make everything look gorgeous, because I love seeing those schools of fish when we had them in there.
So Stefan, I also have to tell you that a lot of the comments coming up are awesome presentation. Thank you so much. People have loved your presentation.
Thank you.
So we are coming up to the top of the hour here, and this has been a great session for Music and Mavens. I know I've really appreciated it, and I can see by the questions and the nodding of heads around the screens that so many other people have really enjoyed. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I do hope it has motivated everybody to take another visit to our gorgeous, fabulous zoo and to learn more about those wonderful polar bears. Thank you so much, Stefan. And I think we'll all sign off now. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.